Ascent Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Intellectual Property, a Very Short Introduction, 2nd edition, by Siva Vaidhyanathan, narrated by Shawn K. Jain. Preface. This book serves three purposes. First, it offers an account of the basic terms of and justifications for the various forms of intellectual property. Second, it sets out the broad contours of debate about the powerful cultural and economic issues that are at work in the world today. And third, it guides curious listeners to some of the best recent books, articles, and websites on global intellectual property. My own travels with intellectual property have been varied and strange. In 1990, I was a newspaper reporter in Texas. I drove up to Taylor, Texas, a small town north of Austin, to interview a young man who was trying to sell packages of condoms that he called stealth condoms. To ensure no one else would market stealth condoms and drive him out of business, the man filed for trademark protection with the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. However, lawyers for the giant U.S. defense contractor, the Northrop Corporation, filed a motion to stop the trademark registration. Northrop had developed the B-2 stealth airplane for the U.S. military. In the filing, Northrop's lawyers asserted that the presence of a cardboard package with 3 condoms, one red, one white, one blue, would likely cause confusion in the marketplace. This was a funny story, but it got me thinking. What public purpose is served by a trademark system that would cause a major defense contractor to spend money on lawyers to stop a young man from selling condoms by mail out of his home? Is the entire trademark system rigged to favor the big and powerful? How can we justify such a system? Does the trademark system benefit society in general, or just those companies that were successful and wealthy enough to defend their marks? And how does trademark law fit into the larger concept of intellectual property? Meanwhile, I was making a living producing work that a large media company claimed as its property. What was the role of my labor in the matrix of ownership and creativity? What was my stake in the system? Why didn't I own my own writing? Under what conditions would I? As a reporter, I constantly quoted from other published sources. My work often found its way into newspapers far from Austin, Texas, via news services. I even found some reporting I had done on a horrific mass murder in northern Mexico, quoted in a cheap, exploitive paperback account of the crimes. What justifies that act of borrowing and quoting? How much borrowing is ethical? How much borrowing is legal? And what's the difference between the ethical and legal concerns? At about the same time, I noticed that popular music was changing. Through the 1980s and early 1990s, I had been closely following hip-hop music. I was as excited about the creativity, energy, and do-it-yourself spirit of hip-hop in the late 1980s as I had been of punk rock in the early 1980s. By 1991, I noticed that the music had changed. The new work lacked the texture and richness that had marked the finest albums of the late 1980s, such as Public Enemy's It Takes a Nation of Millions to Hold Us Back, and the Beastie Boys' Paul's Boutique. Instead, the digital samples of others' music that made up the intricate bed of sound in those great albums was replaced by a thinner, less interesting, less intricate collection of more obvious samples. The language of sampling seemed to become simpler and less interesting. There was less play and less depth to the music by 1992. I knew that several hip-hop artists had faced copyright suits over sampling in 1990 and 1991. So I wondered if the law had had such a profound effect on the art. After a bit of research, I concluded that it had. With a bit more research, I sought to explain the larger, longer relationship between copyright and creativity in American history. That project became the reason I quit the newspaper business and entered graduate school. And it became the germ of my first book, published in 2001, Copyrights and Copy Wrongs: The Rise of Intellectual Property and How It Threatens Creativity. By 2001, copyright had exploded into public consciousness, largely through the remarkable rise and fall of Napster, the first easy-to-use digital file-sharing service. The United States had radically expanded copyright law in the 1990s in anticipation of the digital moment. But nothing had prepared the copyright industries for the torrent of unauthorized peer-to-peer distribution over the Internet, starting in about 2000. Meanwhile, computer software had blossomed from a mere hobby to a multi-billion-dollar global industry in the 1980s and 1990s, without any clear sense of how intellectual property would work for it or against it. At about the same time that U.S. courts ruled that software could enjoy the protection of patent law as well as copyright, the movement to lock computer code open for the benefit of security, stability, quality, and creativity, and to some humanity, grew to be called the free and open source software movement. As someone thrown into the copyright battles of the early 21st century, despite my training as a 19th century cultural historian, I felt compelled to make sense of these and other trends that were remaking our global information ecosystem. Those interests are reflected in my second book, published in 2004, The Anarchist in the Library: How the Clash Between Freedom and Control is Hacking the Real World and Crashing the System. The copyright wars of the first decade of the 21st century yielded a global free culture movement, with law professor Lawrence Lessig as its intellectual leader. Globally, others concerned with issues beyond copyright and creativity, including biopiracy and the cost of pharmaceuticals in developing nations, launched the Access to Knowledge movement. During the decade, the industries devoted to expanding and strengthening intellectual property succeeded in legislatures and courts around the world, and the United States embedded intellectual property standards into trade treaties with other nations. The issues were becoming more interesting and important every week. Then, in late 2004, Google announced it would begin to scan into electronic form millions of books from dozens of university libraries, many of which would still be covered by copyright. The ensuing debate and lawsuits drew me into the fascinating world of search engines, internet policy, and the future of libraries and books. The research generated my third book, published in 2011, The Googleization of Everything and Why We Should Worry. But my relationship with the diverse field of practices, norms, laws, and regulations that we imprecisely call intellectual property is not the story I want to tell with this very short introduction. Instead, I want to tell your story, or rather, our story. If you are one of the relatively few people on Earth with a disposable income to purchase this book and the skills and leisure time to read it, then you are already deeply implicated in most forms of intellectual property. If you receive and send email, text messages, or post to social media services, you are a copyright holder, and likely a copyright infringer. If you paid a premium for the latest smartphone, then a substantial portion of that price went to pay to enforce patents held by the company that made your phone, or, just as likely, paid to license patents owned by another company. Perhaps a portion of your cost paid for a judgment or settlement in a patent infringement case between makers of mobile phones. If you took an over-the-counter allergy medicine today, you most likely paid a fraction of the price you would have paid for the same medicine back in 1994, when many of the most popular remedies were still covered by patents and were available only at very high cost via prescription in much of the world. And if you recently purchased a hammer, a ladder, a hose, or a toaster, then you participated in a part of the global economy in which no one owns the design of such common and now old devices. But companies such as Stanley, Black & Decker, and Krups aggressively brand these common items with their protected trademarks, in hope of convincing us that there is some dependable level of quality inherent in their tools. The world economy increasingly invests time and money in intangible, aesthetic, entertaining, or smartly designed products, and so intellectual property becomes a bigger part of the price we pay for each item we buy, a sort of lawyer tax or innovation tax. It also becomes a subject of policy debate the world over. After all, when the wealthy nations of the world design and market medicine that could save thousands of lives every day in those parts of the world lacking the cash to pay for those medicines, we all have to ask ourselves what sort of economy we should design for the world that might meet our health and economic needs, as well as our ethical and moral obligations. This book is intended for a global audience, but my knowledge is biased by my nationality and experience. Many of the stories and issues in the book rely on developments in the United States. Nonetheless, I have tried my best to relate these issues to more general and global trends. If I have done my job, you will finish this book more curious about these issues than you were when you started it. Chapter 1. How to Read Starbucks, or Why Intellectual Property Matters More Than You Think. I'm writing this in a Starbucks shop in Charlottesville, Virginia. Every Starbucks in the world is recognizable, even though the stores are not identical. Some have beige wooden chairs and tables. This one has dark furniture. Most, but not all, have green trim painted on the walls and doors. This one has large sepia-toned posters of various coffee brewing technologies. And being Charlottesville, the home of Thomas Jefferson, a large portrait of the former president hangs here with a historical note about his relationship to coffee. The first patent granted for a coffee grinder in the United States was issued to Jefferson's dentist, Thomas Bruff. The design of every Starbucks is guided by theme and variation. The common thematic elements of the ideal Starbucks include calming music played at a comfortable volume, soft lighting that allows for reading, and staff wearing green aprons. Every Starbucks strives to be visually and orally calming, or at least comforting. Beyond specific design elements, the very predictability of the design generates comfort among users. Yet variation is just as important. Starbucks stores are designed to speak to the local as well as the global, thus the Jefferson portrait. When we enter a Starbucks anywhere in the world, we share a cosmopolitan space with everyone else in a Starbucks anywhere in the world. We are told by the design to be present, yet connected to the larger world. Internet connectivity and global newspapers help. We use the caffeine to feel energized and engaged, yet the music, lighting, and seating tell us to relax. We are invited to purchase coffee beans from Africa, South America, or Indonesia in forms and sizes marked by Italian words. American jazz and rhythm and blues float from speakers all over the world. And the name and logo of Starbucks is quintessentially American. For a few minutes in the day, you can step just outside Charlottesville, Chicago, Caracas, or Cairo. You can just be in the Republic of Starbucks. How does Starbucks do this? Starbucks sells food and beverages in more than 60 countries. It grew from a local Seattle roaster established in 1971 into a global behemoth by the end of the 20th century by introducing gourmet coffee and espresso to parts of the world heretofore untouched by anything more flavorful than Nescafe. Starbucks grew big and wealthy by creating, leveraging, and managing intellectual property. The company has paid close attention to the trade dress or design elements of its stores, ensuring that competing coffee outlets do not mimic it too closely. It based its trademarked name and logo on a character from a 19th century American novel that is in the public domain, and thus no longer protected by any intellectual property. Starbuck was the first mate on the whaling ship Pequod in Herman Melville's Moby Dick. The Photalian names that Starbucks gives its sweetened drinks, Fizzio and Frappuccino, also are trademarked. At the front counter of this Starbucks store, one can purchase compact discs with music that Starbucks has determined appeals to the clientele of this particular region or store. Starbucks runs its own music publishing company, so it licenses compositions and recordings from artists and other labels. Artists as well known as Paul McCartney, Alanis Morissette, and Carly Simon have signed deals to release albums through Starbucks's Hear Music label. The company's entertainment production wing, Starbucks Entertainment, produced and distributed, among other works, the 2006 film Akeelah and the Bee. And Starbucks has a deal with Apple to distribute iTunes music via its wireless network in stores. Most striking is the simple beige cardboard sleeve that Starbucks provides to shield my sensitive hand from the heat radiating from a cup of Tazo Awake tea. As one would expect, the sleeve carries the trademarked logo, a green outline of a mermaid with a star in her crown, and it displays the trademarked typeface name of the company on one side of the sleeve. The other side of the sleeve carries the numbers of 3 patents that Starbucks has secured for this invention. One patent number covers the United States, another Canada, and a third the United Kingdom. Related foreign patents and foreign patent applications pending, the sleeve reads. The U.S. patent number 6863644 does not cover the sleeve itself. Insulating sleeves are covered by a slew of other patents. According to the application documents on file with the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office, this patent protects a machine and method for producing beverage container holders of consistently high quality at high production rates and at an economical cost is disclosed herein. Consider how many lawyer work hours are embedded in this simple piece of corrugated cardboard. Starbucks lawyers were part of the design process and the marketing discussions. They oversee the filing of trademarks and vigilantly enforce these patents and trademarks. A few years ago, the Starbucks sleeve design also carried a copyright notice, as if there were copyrightable text worth protecting on the sleeve. There are 2 lessons we can take from looking at a local Starbucks as a text to examine intellectual property. First, Starbucks is just as much an intellectual property company as it is a food and beverage company. And second, one reason your latte costs so much at Starbucks is that a good portion of the price pays for all the lawyers who protect that cardboard sleeve and everything else that is special about Starbucks' presentation. Intellectual property is a core function of the cultural elements from which we build meaning and of the commercial ecosystem that fuels so much human activity. And Starbucks has mastered both dynamics. That's not to say that managing Starbucks' rise and intellectual property assets has been easy. Back in 1999, Starbucks opened its first store in China and quickly registered its most valuable trademarks in China, including its name in Mandarin, Xingbaku, which sounds a lot like the Chinese word for star and the sound of bucks. Predictably, imitators soon sprang up around China, hoping to capitalize on the growing upper middle class and its expanding luxury consumption habits. One company tried to use the name Xingbaku, claiming that it had registered the trademark before Starbucks did. A Chinese court ruled in 2005 that the Chinese imitator had violated a 2001 law prohibiting the use of another company's trade dress and marks. This was a major test of the new law and marked a step toward fuller integration of the cultural as well as commercial ecosystems of China and the United States. That case sent a signal to other foreign companies that China might be a safe place to conduct consumer commerce on a massive scale. Various forms of piracy still dominate the cultural markets of China. Starbucks also has tried to prevent other forms of intellectual property from raising the wholesale prices it pays or inhibiting the ways it wants to conduct business. In 2007, Ethiopia moved to register as trademarks several of its most popular local versions of coffee beans, including Sidamo, Harar, and Yirgacheffe. Starbucks moved to block the registration in the United States. Ethiopia was attempting to go beyond the established system of geographic origin protection that will be explored later in this book. If Ethiopia were to achieve trademarks for these bean sources, companies like Starbucks and many smaller shops and distributors would have had to pay license fees to call the coffee by its name. This could have returned more money to coffee farmers, or at least to the Ethiopian government, so it would cost Starbucks and other distributors significantly more to use and boast of those sources. After much negotiation and considerable public criticism by Oxfam and other human rights activists and organizations, Starbucks agreed to withdraw its opposition to Ethiopia registering trademarks for the origins and agreed to promote the beans in its stores and pay premium for them. Starbucks was able to market the switch as an exercise in corporate social responsibility. It raised its coffee prices soon after, and was able to boast to its upscale customers that buying branded beans from Ethiopia was helping bolster the incomes of poor farmers. Ethiopia's effort to trademark traditional agricultural products is an experiment in redressing some of the power imbalances in global commodity trade that have left much of Africa on the losing side of the balance for about 400 years. With every new assertion of an intellectual property right, someone pays a higher price for the good or service. The new money did not make the farmers any wealthier, as Starbucks and the Ethiopian government had predicted. But a model of how to conduct global trade had certainly changed. Reading Starbucks as an intellectual property text is helpful, but it is not the only company that has managed to leverage a tangle of rights into a presence in global culture and commerce. Coca-Cola demonstrated the power of a global trademark many decades ago. Pharmaceutical companies use their patent and trademark power to keep prices high on the medications they try to sell globally, despite very different medical needs and abilities to pay across the globe. Publishers like Bertelsmann, the German owners of Penguin Random House and other major imprints, and the New York Times, try to navigate different cultural norms and copyright traditions, while the World Wide Web spreads its own set of expectations about the availability and cost of content, signaling to its users that content should be available instantly and at no marginal cost. Companies in China and the United States increasingly team up for co-production of major global action films, in part to limit piracy in China. People around the world are building new cultural practices and products using the signs and symbols available to them commercially and otherwise. Intellectual property laws complicate and perhaps impede this sort of cultural play that enriches daily life. And perhaps most seriously, a growing global movement aims to increase the access to knowledge that every resident of the planet can enjoy. Every assertion of an intellectual property right is also a restriction on what others can do or say. Understanding the intellectual property ecosystem demands a full acknowledgement of the justifications for these systems of law and practice, and an account of their consequences, positive and negative. Justification. Imagine a world without intellectual property laws. It could be a nightmare. The medicine you get from the pharmacy could be sugar pills, shaped and marked up to look like the name brand your doctor prescribed. Drug companies would focus on proven products, even if they had to sell them cheaply, rather than investing in risky research, testing, development, and marketing of new treatments. The next sip of Coca-Cola you take could poison you, because someone concocted a cheap brown liquid and placed it in bottles marked with the familiar red logo. A laboratory in Korea that invents an efficient electric cell suitable to replace diesel engines in large trucks would opt to keep the technology secret until it can find a vendor, thus robbing others of important basic knowledge that fostered the technological breakthrough. Major recording artists might cease releasing their work in high-quality, mass-marketed forms, and instead rely on amateur recording, rough production quality, informal networks of promotion, and constant live performance to financially justify the work they do. And no more epically expensive superhero movies would emanate from Hollywood. Millions of people in the creative industries would lose their jobs, as investors would flee markets that they couldn't predict or trust. And this book might never have been professionally edited, designed, published, marketed, or distributed in such a lovely form. But a world without intellectual property might not be a total dystopia either. The cost of essential existing pharmaceuticals would drop to levels that would allow billions more people around the world to afford them. Governments might step up to fund and regulate almost all drug research through public universities and laboratories. Coca-Cola might go out of business after a few poisonings, but people would drink more sugar-free, caffeine-free, and color-free water. Obesity and type 2 diabetes might wane. New and profound inventions could find their way to market, and knowledge about them could flow faster, through means of disclosure more open and efficient than the current patent system. Artists might abandon the fantasy of striking it rich with a major label global hit, and fans could reward performers who have mastered their crafts, rather than those with major marketing machines behind them. Small-time video makers could deploy the cheap and powerful editing and animation tools available for the personal computer to fill our lives with diverse and lively expressions. The money currently pumped into the major creative industries might spread more equitably, rewarding real creativity rather than inefficient, top-heavy multinational corporations. And I still might have written this book, only to eschew this esteemed publishing house for an open and free distribution system, in hopes that listeners would appreciate my work enough to leave a nice tip. Of course, It's rare that someone seriously argues for intellectual property nihilism. Our challenge, as we examine and assess the intellectual property systems at work in the world today, is to create and maintain the positive results of intellectual property while limiting the negative. We want new pharmaceuticals to help us live better and longer, but we want more than wealthy people to be able to live better and longer as well. We would like the occasional summer blockbuster Hollywood or Bollywood or Nollywood film, but we would also like witty and brilliant homemade parodies of such films to show up on YouTube. The world we actually occupy already suffers from many of the maladies of an intellectual property-free state. It also benefits from many of the lovely aspects of light, irrelevant, or unenforceable laws. Major films are available on street corners and computer screens around the world within hours of their release in Los Angeles. Musicians have seen many of their traditional revenue sources dry up, as others rise insignificantly. Knockoff drugs cost many lives already. The United Nations estimates that as many as half of the anti-malarial drugs distributed in Africa are fake. Meanwhile, firms in India and Brazil have been producing antiretroviral drugs for the developing world over stern opposition from the United States, the European Union, and the major global pharmaceutical companies. No one is happy with the status quo. Global health activists criticize big pharmaceutical companies for keeping their medicines too expensive for too long, and the companies complain about unauthorized generic versions of their drugs undermining the market, and thus harming their ability to fund further research and development. Film and recording companies around the world worry that too many of their products are available for no cost through electronic networks, or sold on street corners from Shanghai to Sao Paulo. Yet the very copyright laws that these companies wrote and promoted often stifle legitimate activities such as research, scholarship, journalism, and creative remixing of hallmarks of global culture. Since about the turn of the 21st century, we have seen competing political visions for what sort of global information ecosystem we should have. One committed to the desires of firms that fund and promote expensive goods and expressions, or one that serves the interests of the broadest collection of humanity without regard to wealth or cultural status. Industries have lobbied for stronger, broader, and longer intellectual property protections. The Access to Knowledge movement has promoted a lighter, more democratic vision of information flow and creativity. Of course, it is not that simple or straightforward. Major firms such as Google, now part of its holding company Alphabet, have lobbied for lighter copyright protections, largely because a wilder, livelier web benefits the company that effectively manages the web in much of the world. And many indigenous cultural groups have advocated for a new form of intellectual property protection to prevent multinational corporations from exploiting traditional knowledge without regard for the dignity and integrity of the group. Is intellectual property a useful term? Despite the centrality of intellectual property policy to so many aspects of the global economy and daily life, it remains one of the most confusing, arcane, and misunderstood subjects. The very phrase intellectual property is a source of so much confusion. The phrase is as contested as it is ubiquitous. It stands in for a complex tangle of laws, policies, and values that govern the dissemination of ideas, expressions, inventions, creativity, and data collection. Each area of law that sits under the umbrella of intellectual property has its own justification, history, and core values. These areas of law often work at cross purposes. Yet in public discourse, intellectual property stands as a general and undifferentiated regulatory system that prevents some people from using the fruits of others' intellectual work. This unfortunate conflation has caused widespread misunderstanding about the law and who may benefit from it. The first problem with the phrase is that it conflates so many distinct areas of law and practice that have different historical roots and perform different functions. Copyright and patent are closely related historically, and both systems were designed to serve as incentive systems for creativity and invention. Trademarks and trade secrets serve to protect the reputation and inner workings of companies, but do not work as incentive systems. Too often we throw around the phrase intellectual property when we should be more precise. Second, the phrase
Sample complete. Ready to continue?